The end of the ANC is here, and Syria is the final nail in the coffin. Those who follow South African politics really closely will know that the ANC really seems to be approaching its end of days. We know how they keep on falling in the polls, and it really does seem as if the party will crash and finally collapse either at this election or in the 2029 general election. But in the last few days, I've noticed some drastic changes, particularly in the Middle East and particularly in Syria. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what exactly does Syria have to do with South Africa? Firstly, it's not really a trade partner or anything that we hear about. Secondly, while the ANC does have its Middle East ties, Syria is not the name of a country that people really associate the ANC with. And so this can sound very random. But if we zoom out and we look at what's going on in the world at the moment, we can actually see how this shift that I'm going to talk about in the Middle East actually directly affects the ANC and will actually affect the funding that the ANC receives ahead of the election and ultimately their performance. Now, for those of you who might not have seen it, I did a video on my other channel called Middle East Insider on this very topic. And if you'd like to check it out, the link is in the description box below and pinned to the comments section. In addition, you'll see that this video is a collaboration between both channels. So please be sure to click the subscribe button below the video and make sure that you are subscribed to both the PowerPod and the Middle East Insider as well. And so without us getting too distracted, because this is quite a complicated topic, I'm going to make it as easy to understand as possible. Firstly, I'm going to explain why we need to focus on the ANC's connection with the Middle East and why this connection is so important to the party's survival. I'm then going to explain what exactly is happening with regards to Syria and how it's affecting the Middle East. And then finally, once we've seen both of these issues and connected the dots, we'll be able to understand how an action in Syria is actually leading to the downfall of the ANC and potentially its complete collapse on November the 4th. So, to start off with the crucial connection between the ANC and the Middle East. Those of you who follow this channel and many other people as well will know that there has been the rumor that Iran allegedly paid the ANC to take Israel to the ICJ on an accusation of genocide. Now, just to establish a timeline here, October the 7th is of course when the Hamas attacks on Israel happened. And then a little over 2 months, so in December of 2023, the ANC announced its decision to file the ICJ case. And of course, the case got underway. Now, it's very important for us to realize that there are two potential funders of the ANC who convinced them to approach the ICJ. One is Iran, but another lesser known potential funder is Qatar. And Qatar is, of course, an ally to Iran, although I would say that they're a much more transactional party than an ideological one. Because after all, we see how the Qataris will side with Iran when it's convenient, but then quickly backtrack and side with the US when it's convenient, because after all, we see how they actually are the home to the largest US military base in the Middle East. But then at the same time, they like to be a mediator on behalf of Iran with a lot of negotiations. So we can see that they're very two-faced. But the reason why I'm mentioning these two is as follows. Days after the October 7th attack happened, Naledi Pandor, who was the DIRCO minister at the time, decided to get on a call with Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas, and she also happened to meet with the Iranian president at the time in Tehran itself. And of course, we understand how all of these people I've mentioned were in Tehran. They had many high-level meetings. So of course, there's the link over there. However, what many people forget about is the fact that the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, actually flew to Qatar in December 2023. It was there that he had his first ever official visit to Qatar. And at that time, After meeting with the Emir of Qatar, he actually held a press conference and announced the pursuit of the ICC case. So, not to be confused with the ICJ case, the ICC case was separate because it sought out the arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. And so the ICJ was aimed at Israel as a country on an accusation of genocide, whereas the ICC case sought to arrest certain Israeli personnel on war crimes charges, or at least accusations of war crimes. And so here we had two separate cases, and it really does seem as if both Qatar and Iran could have been involved. Now, why exactly is it that we know that there's a very strong likelihood of this happening? Well, it's simple. The ANC in the lead up to October the 7th was believed to have around $500 million in debt. This is something that I covered in a video quite a long time ago, and ANC officials and the mainstream media in South Africa both acknowledged this problem. However, when December rolled around and all of a sudden the ICJ case was filed, the ANC treasurer and certain other people seemed to be asserting that the ANC somehow managed to wipe its debt clean and, of course, had money in order to campaign with in the lead up to the elections in May 2024. Now, of course, this is a very fast turnaround, and something that was quite shocking is that when the IEC had its financial report on political party funding for that financial year, it showed that the ANC had other income, as it's categorized, of over 400 million rand. And just think about this. You had over 400 million rand in other income, yet in the previous financial year, the other income category amounted to a little over 20 million rand. So this is a massive leap. And of course, there was no suggestion as to what the nature of these funds were and who the ANC actually got the funds from. And so there is a very strong circumstantial evidence that really suggests that the ANC must have received external funding from somewhere. And of course, the timing, particularly given the time from October the 7th to December, and then, of course, the economic turnaround of the ANC, well, it seems like a lot more than just a simple coincidence. Now, given the importance of Iran and potentially Qatar to the ANC's financial stability as well as its international standing, the Middle East war has a direct impact on the ANC's survival. Now, I want us to take something into account before I speak about the Syria issue, which is this. When October the 7th happened, Iran and potentially Qatar were in a much better position than they are now to fund the ANC in exchange for favors. You see, when October the 7th happened, Israel was caught off guard. The Israelis were on the back foot, and they were focused solely on fighting Hamas in Gaza. Now, at that time, Iran had all the time on their hands in the world. They had money, resources, and pretty much nobody was watching them. And so they had the luxury of being able to continue funding their proxies in the region, such as Hamas and, of course, Hezbollah in Gaza, as well as others. But they also had the bandwidth to approach South Africa and continue this lawfare against Israel. So fighting against Israel on both the military front and the legal front. Qatar, similarly, also didn't have too much pressure on them. However, since the start of the Iran war, things have changed. According to US Central Command data, the US and Israel seems to have eliminated around 90% of Iran's navy and potentially even more of its air force. In fact, certain reports claim that the entire air force fleet is eradicated. When it comes to their ballistic missile program, it's believed that around 50 to 75% of Iranian ballistic missiles are still intact. However, around 50% of launchers are believed to have been destroyed. And of course, you need launchers in order to actually fire the missiles themselves. Otherwise, they're useless. We also understand that the Iranian leadership, at least the original one from before the war, has been largely eliminated. And so there's a lot of mass confusion in the country. But beyond just their own problem on the military front, we know that they're suffering from economic difficulties as well. According to certain American reports, the Iranian economy was losing up to $500 million a day due to the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, as well as countries that were simply not trading with them, whereas they perhaps would have been trading with them in the past. There's also the fact that not only do they have their own internal problems, but their proxies are also suffering. So, for example, not only does Iran like to attack Israel directly, but they like their proxies to do it. In fact, I would argue that they prefer for their proxies to do it so that they themselves are not in the firing line. So Hamas in Gaza was, of course, their primary proxy that they've been using. However, we know that the majority of Hamas has been eliminated. And of course, not only does Israel control about 70 to 80% of Gaza at the moment, but we also know that the Hamas leadership is in disarray. For example, Yahya Sinwar, the orchestrator of October the 7th, he's gone. The political head, Ismail Haniyeh, is also gone. We know for a fact that Khaled Mashal, who also used to be the political chief, well, he was injured in a few assassination attempts, and he's living in Qatar at the moment and has been distanced from the central leadership. So he's no longer in connection. One of the main military masterminds of Hamas at the time, Mohammed Daif, he was actually the main military mastermind for a few decades. He was also eliminated during the war. And so ultimately, they really have lost the best and brightest in the Hamas leadership that the organization had to offer. Yes, certain people such as Hassan Youssef, Sheikh Hassan Youssef, might be alive, but he's been in and out of prison more times than I can count, and he's not a military expert. He's more of a religious leader. And so again, we see how Hamas is severely weakened and really disorganized. And so they can't really carry out Iran's bidding like they used to. When we take a look at the other proxies around the Middle East, well, the Houthis in Yemen are probably the least advanced of any of them, technologically speaking, and there's a great geographical distance between Yemen and Israel, so they're not really very effective fighters. When it comes to the PMF in Iraq, well, it's a similar problem where you've got the geographical distance and they have actually been suffering with their own internal fighting, whether it be with the Kurds or other Iraqi factions as well. And so ultimately, the last remaining and probably the most formidable Iranian proxy, historically speaking, is Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so all of a sudden, Iran has a strategic calculus to make. Do they look to enrich themselves, which I do believe they are doing? Or do they perhaps also look to strengthen some of their proxies around the Middle East in order to continue fighting Israel? Well, at this moment in time, the only proxy that might be worth strengthening is Hezbollah, given their military might, especially when compared to the other proxies I've mentioned. However, this is where the problem comes in. And this is where the video that I did for Middle East Insider comes in, which is that Donald Trump has decided to make a friend out of Syria, and using both Syria and Israel seems to be collapsing Hezbollah. You see, Israel is not only working together with the Lebanese government and the official Lebanese army in order to reinstate state control in those Hezbollah territories in southern Lebanon, but they also happen to be continuing to strike Hezbollah and refusing to withdraw from their security buffer zone in southern Lebanon. Yes, there are certain areas where, according to the pilot project, the Lebanese army is asserting control in southern Lebanon. However, Israel maintains its military presence there. But at the same time, Trump has made a strategic calculation. He's realized that while the Lebanese army to the north is pressurizing Hezbollah and Israel is pressurizing them to the south, well, you've still got the eastern portion of the country to worry about. And who's on the east? It's Syria. And so what Trump has done is that since the fall of the Assad regime, he's actually befriended the new Syrian government, as shady and problematic as they may be. And he has essentially said, well, we're going to roll back economic and even weapons sanctions on Syria, and we're also going to remove them from the list of state sponsors for terrorism. And in exchange, we're going to look to empower them militarily. You see, in recent days, Syria has amassed thousands of troops and tanks along its shared border with Lebanon, just in case Hezbollah decides to try something against them. What's more, Trump even made a few comments directed at Israel where he said, you know what, Israel actually needs to dial back what it's doing in Lebanon because I think the Syrians should rather take care of it. And so all of a sudden, Trump has really changed the game in the Middle East because not only is Iran under pressure, but he's actually isolating them by using the likes of Syria, who are by no means ideologically aligned with America, but using them against Iran, because what they're doing is they're helping to isolate Hezbollah, isolate Iran, and essentially cut off Iranian influence. Now, what we see is that Iran is in a very difficult position because they have to use their funding more wisely. Remember how I told you that they had the bandwidth to fund Hamas and even fund South Africa potentially in the lead up to the ICJ case? Well, they no longer have this luxury. While the South African election is fast approaching, Iran can't run to South Africa and say to the ANC, well, we're going to keep funding you if you keep doing favors for us, because they no longer have the resources and manpower available. Now, all of a sudden, Iran sees how its different proxies around the Middle East are struggling. Hamas is basically no longer an option for them. And so they have to think to themselves, well, with the limited funding and resources we have, where are we going to spend our money? And it's not going to be on South Africa, or rather the ANC. It's going to be on strengthening their own regime from within and potentially sending funds to Hezbollah in order to help them in this difficult period, especially with Syria moving in and, of course, the Lebanese army and Israel pretty much surrounding them from all sides. And so ultimately, what we see here is a situation where, unlike the previous election campaign, the ANC won't be able to get Middle Eastern money to fund this campaign. Now, for those of you who were in South Africa at the time of the last election, you'll notice how for a very long time the ANC's election campaign was very subdued, but then all of a sudden in the new year, and especially in the weeks leading up to the election, they managed to get posters up everywhere, huge billboards over the highway. I even remember how, more importantly than any of that, they managed to execute their key election tactic, which is busing. Now, for those of you who might not know what that is, the ANC likes to go to its traditional strongholds and get people, especially impoverished people, where they give them T-shirts, they pay for their bus fares, they get them on buses, on taxis, and send them to the ballot boxes in order to vote. And of course, they'll try to give them a couple of freebies and goodies in order to convince them to vote ANC. Now, this is a tactic that they've employed pretty much at every single election, and that's why a lot of the time when election polls show the ANC doing badly, the ANC normally manages to make a somewhat notable recovery on election day because of this busing strategy. But all of a sudden, they might not have the money for busing and for campaign posters and everything like they did in 2024, because all of a sudden, Iran and Qatar, by extension, are distracted. They no longer have the bandwidth to focus on the ANC and instead have to focus on their own problems in the Middle East. What's more, if we look at the ANC allies around the world, there really isn't anyone else to help them. Russia has its own fight with Ukraine, and what's really interesting about Russia is that Putin seems to have had a relationship with Jacob Zuma, and we know that in the lead to the 2024 election, there was an anti-DA campaign and pro-MK campaign on social media, and it seems to have been of a Russian origin. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Russia has decided that the ANC is no longer the horse it wants to back, especially since it seems to be the losing horse. Perhaps the Russians will look at MK of Jacob Zuma as their new ally in South Africa. I don't know whether or not this will be the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if this does happen. But then if we take a look at the other potential ANC allies, well, China's never shown much interest in them. We also see in Latin America how their traditional communist or socialist allies are also pretty much out of the picture. Venezuela was a very good friend to the ANC. However, we saw that since the capture of Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela pretty much has a puppet government that answers to America. They're not going to be interested in irritating America by siding with the ANC. Furthermore, if we take a look at Cuba, well, America has taken a great interest in flipping them as well. And so all of a sudden, the ANC, one by one, has been cut off from its global allies. And so it really begs the question, well, where are they going to get money for this campaign? Because after all, while the ANC may receive money, we know that they are very good at spending the money as well. And just like in the past, they've managed to loot, they've managed to be enriched, but they end up losing the money again. And so whatever money Iran paid them, one can bet that that money is already gone. And so this leads me to the conclusion, which is the fact that if the ANC, with its new surge in funding just weeks before the 2024 election, could only get 40% of the vote, it's a 17% drop in support, despite the influx of funds that allowed them to do their busing strategy, despite their massive, poster campaign and tents up all over the show. If even with all of that renewed funding and all of that renewed campaign energy, they were still only able to get 40% of the vote, well, what is going to happen now when we already see how over the past 2 years, their support levels are dropping all the time? When we already see that the money that they may have had from the Middle East in the past is not coming in. When we already see how if you go to major metros like Joburg, there's virtually no campaign posters in sight. We see the DA, we see Action SA, we even see MK, even the Freedom Front Plus. Yet compared to those parties, the ANC is pretty much invisible. In fact, they haven't even announced their mayoral candidates for most of the different metros they hope to compete in. And so in my view, while we don't know exactly what's going on behind the scenes, there does seem to be a very big change in the tide, which is this. The ANC is being completely cut off from its traditional global allies. And if, with money and backing and resources, they only got 40% in the last election, their drop-off in this election should be even greater, because now they really seem to be getting hit from all sides. They're losing their international audience. They're definitely losing the local audience, as polling is showing. And there really doesn't seem to be anybody, especially among the youth, who are suddenly interested in anything that they are selling. In fact, their last hope seems to be those old ANC loyalists who supported them from even back during apartheid days. And so I don't think it would be a crazy idea to assume that the ANC could indeed collapse in this election. And if they don't, 2029 will be the year that they are really done and dusted. Thank you very much for tuning into this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to subscribe to the channel for more content, subscribe to the Middle East Insider as well, and just let me know in the comment section below, what do you make of this whole situation? Do you think that the ANC is finally about to collapse, or do you think they might still have a few years left in the tank? I'll be curious to hear your thoughts. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.